Elon Musk stood at the podium, the silence in the room almost tangible. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on him, awaiting his words. The air was heavy with expectation, not from the usual groundbreaking announcements of Tesla or SpaceX, but from something deeper. Elon gripped the edge of the podium tightly, his knuckles turning white. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and for a moment, it seemed as though he was wrestling with himself. "I'm not here to talk about the future," he began, his voice low and uneven. "Not about plans or ideas. I want to tell you a story." The audience shifted in their seats, intrigued by this unexpected approach. Elon wasn't known for speeches like this. He paused, looking down as if searching for courage. When he finally looked up, his gaze was intense yet vulnerable. "It's about Moses," he said quietly, his words reverberating through the stillness of the room. "And the Exodus." The room grew even quieter, as if the weight of his words demanded silence. Elon continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking about him a lot lately. Moses, the man who led the Israelites out of Egypt. The man who stood before Pharaoh and demanded, 'Let my people go.' The man who faced impossible odds and still found a way forward." He paused, scanning the audience as if to measure their reaction. "But what strikes me most about Moses isn't his courage, his leadership, or even the miracles. It's that he didn't want to do any of it." Elon's voice softened, and his words carried an emotional resonance that was rarely seen from him. Moses didn't think he was the right person for the job. He didn't want to lead. He didn't feel capable. And lately, I've been feeling the same way, like I'm not enough, like I don't have what it takes to do what I've been called to do. A ripple of emotion passed through the audience. Some wiped their eyes discreetly. Others leaned in, captivated by the raw vulnerability of a man they had only known as a visionary leader. Elon took a deep breath, his voice steadying. "Moses argued with God," he said. "He said, 'Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? I'm not a good speaker. I'm not strong enough.' He doubted himself every step of the way. And yet, God chose him. God called him." His voice wavered slightly as he continued, "I've felt that weight too. The fear of not being good enough, not being strong enough, of failing. But Moses taught me something. He didn't lead because he was perfect. He didn't lead because he had all the answers. He led because he trusted." Elon paused again, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. "Moses stood in front of the Red Sea," he said, his voice growing firmer. Behind him, Pharaoh's army was closing in. In front of him, an endless sea stretched out, uncrossable. He had no idea what to do, but he trusted. God told him to raise his staff, and he did. And the sea parted. Elon's voice cracked, and he looked away for a moment, running a hand through his hair. "I feel like I'm standing in front of my own Red Sea," he admitted, his vulnerability laid bare. "Everything feels impossible. I don't know what the next step is. I'm scared that no matter what I do, it won't be enough." The audience was utterly silent, holding their breath as if afraid to break the moment. "But Moses taught me something," Elon said, his voice growing softer. "Even when the sea looks too big, even when the path ahead feels hopeless, there's a way forward. Not because we can do it on our own, but because there's something greater than us making a way." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Elon's gaze swept over the audience, his eyes glistening. "I don't have all the answers," he confessed. "I don't know how to part the sea in front of me." But Moses didn't either. He just took the step he was asked to take. He trusted when he didn't understand. A few tears began to quietly fall in the room, the emotional connection between speaker and audience palpable. Elon's voice softened further. Moses didn't lead because he was strong. He led because he obeyed. He moved forward not because he was fearless, but because he believed. And that's what I'm trying to do now, to trust, to take one step, even when I'm scared. The room was still, the silence full of emotion and understanding. Elon's words weren't just his own. They resonated deeply with everyone listening. "We all have a Red Sea in front of us," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his journey. "Something that feels too big, too impossible. But maybe, just maybe, the way forward is waiting for us to take that first step, to trust, even when we can't see how it will work out." The room remained completely still, every person caught in the gravity of what he had shared. As Elon stepped back from the podium, the silence lingered. It wasn't an absence of sound but a presence, a quiet understanding that passed between him and the people in that room. They all had their own Red Seas to cross, and for the first time, they believed they could. As the silence lingered in the room, Elon Musk returned to the podium. He gripped its edges firmly, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. The audience remained captivated, their focus unwavering. They had just heard him bare his soul about Moses and the Red Sea. Now, they wondered where he would take them next. Elon's voice broke the stillness, low but resolute. "There's something else about Moses I can't stop thinking about," he began. It wasn't just the Red Sea. It wasn't just the miracles. It was the doubt, his own doubt and the doubt of the people he was leading. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. When Moses first went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," things didn't get better. They got worse. Pharaoh made the Israelites work harder. He took away the straw they needed to make bricks, but demanded the same number of bricks. And the people, they turned on Moses. They blamed him for their suffering. Elon looked out at the audience, his eyes searching their faces. "I think about that a lot," he said quietly. "How it must have felt for Moses to stand there, trying to lead while everyone around him doubted him, questioned him, even blamed him. And the truth is, I felt that too." The room seemed to draw closer around him, as though the audience was leaning in, not just physically but emotionally. Elon's voice grew softer, more introspective. "There are moments when I feel like no matter what I do, it's not enough. Moments when I wonder if I'm the right person for the job. Moments when the weight of expectations feels unbearable." His gaze drifted for a moment, as if lost in thought, before returning to the crowd. "But Moses," he continued, his voice steadying, "he didn't quit. Even when it would have been easier, even when he probably wanted to, he kept going. He didn't lead because he was fearless or because he had all the answers. He led because he trusted, because he believed in something greater than himself." The room was silent, the audience hanging on every word. Elon's vulnerability was unlike anything they had expected, yet it was exactly what they needed to hear. "And that's what I'm trying to hold on to," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "That even when the doubts creep in, even when the people I'm trying to lead question me, I have to keep going. Not because I'm perfect, not because I have all the answers, but because I believe in what we're building, in the future we're working toward." Elon paused, his hands resting lightly on the podium. The weight of his words seemed to settle over the room like a tangible force. "The story of Moses isn't just a story about miracles," he said. "It's a story about perseverance, about faith, about trusting that the path you're on is the right one, even when it feels impossible." He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping the room. "There's something else about Moses that I think we often forget," he continued. "He wasn't just leading people. He was leading people who didn't understand him, who doubted him, who blamed him when things didn't go the way they wanted. And that kind of leadership, it's lonely." The audience leaned in closer, their collective breath seemingly caught in the gravity of his reflection. Elon paused, his eyes scanning the room, seeking understanding in their faces. "I think about that moment often," he continued. "What it must have felt like for Moses to see the culmination of everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for, and know he wouldn't be the one to step into it. To give so much and not be the one to receive the reward." His voice wavered slightly, carrying a hint of vulnerability. "At first, it feels unfair, doesn't it?" he asked, his gaze steady. "To dedicate your life to something so monumental, to pour every ounce of your strength, your courage, your faith into a cause, only to stand on the edge of its fulfillment and realize it's not yours to complete." A heavy silence filled the room as his words sank in. Elon's vulnerability was palpable, and the audience could feel the weight of his introspection. "But the more I think about it," he said, his tone shifting to one of quiet revelation, "the more I realize that Moses' story wasn't about him. It was never about him. It was about what God was doing through him, for the people he was leading, for the generations that would come after them." Elon paused, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. And that's something I'm trying to come to terms with in my own journey, he said. That maybe it's not about me. Maybe it's not about whether I get to see the end result, whether I get to step into the promised land. Maybe it's about the people I'm leading, the foundation we're building, the future we're creating for those who will come after us. The audience remained silent, the power of his words enveloping them. Elon's voice grew softer, but carried an undeniable conviction. Moses fulfilled his purpose, not by entering the promised land, but by leading his people to it. He gave them hope. He gave them a future. And maybe that's what true leadership is, laying the foundation for others to succeed, even if you don't get to see the full outcome. His words resonated deeply, stirring something within the hearts of those listening. Elon looked down for a moment, his hands still resting on the podium. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quieter, almost reverent tone. I've realized that leadership isn't about the rewards you receive or the recognition you achieve. It's about the sacrifices you make, the challenges you endure, and the hope you inspire in others. It's about the legacy you leave behind, not for yourself, but for the people who will come after you. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping the room. And that's not an easy thing to accept, he admitted. It's not easy to let go of the idea that success means crossing the finish line yourself. But Moses' story teaches us that sometimes the greatest impact we can have is not in what we achieve, but in what we enable others to achieve. Elon's words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. The audience was still, their faces reflecting a mix of awe and introspection. His vulnerability had drawn them in, and now they were walking alongside him, grappling with the same questions, the same struggles. There's something else about Moses' story that I think about often, Elon said, his voice steady but reflective. It's the fact that his journey wasn't easy. It wasn't smooth. Leading the Israelites wasn't a straight path from Egypt to the Promised Land. It was filled with setbacks, with rebellion, with moments of doubt and despair. He paused, his gaze steady. And yet, through it all, Moses kept going. Not because he had all the answers, not because he didn't struggle, but because he trusted. He trusted that the work he was doing mattered, even when it was hard, even when it felt thankless, even when he couldn't see the end. Elon's voice softened, carrying a quiet strength. And that's what I hold on to in my own journey, he said. That even when the path is difficult, even when the weight feels unbearable, even when the outcome is uncertain, we have to keep going. Not for ourselves, but for the people who are counting on us, for the future we're trying to build. The room remained silent, the audience deeply moved by his words. Elon stepped back slightly, his hands still gripping the edges of the podium. His vulnerability had opened a door, and the audience had walked through it, stepping into a shared space of reflection and connection. And maybe that's the greatest lesson Moses teaches us, he said quietly, that true leadership isn't about personal glory or achievement. It's about faith. It's about perseverance. It's about trusting that the work we're doing is part of something bigger, something we might not fully understand, but something that will leave a lasting impact for generations to come. Elon's words lingered in the air, their power resonating deeply. For the audience, this wasn't just a story about Moses. It was a story about them, about their own struggles, their own doubts, their own journeys. And in that moment, they realized that they weren't alone, that their struggles were part of something greater, something meaningful. As Elon stepped back from the podium, the room remained utterly still. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of reflection, of connection, of a shared understanding that tied everyone in the room together. Elon's vulnerability had opened a door, and the audience had walked through it, stepping into a space of shared humanity. Elon Musk stood at the podium, his eyes lingering on the audience, the weight of his thoughts pulling him deeper into reflection. His voice was quiet but resolute as he continued. But there's something even more profound in Moses' journey that I think about often. It's the loneliness. It's the isolation that comes with leadership, especially when you're trying to lead people who don't understand you. Moses wasn't just leading people. He was leading people who doubted him, who turned on him, who blamed him for their hardships. The room was still, every person leaning forward, hanging on his every word. Elon's gaze flickered to the floor for a moment as if gathering his thoughts, then lifted again to meet the eyes of the audience. Moses was criticized by the very people he was trying to help, he said. When things weren't going the way they wanted, they blamed him. They were angry with him. They didn't understand why things were so hard, why things weren't improving faster. And Moses, he had to carry the weight of all that, his own doubts and the doubts of the people he was leading. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy with empathy. Elon's voice cracked, and for a moment, the emotions of the moment seemed to hang in the air like a tangible thing. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? He continued, his voice laced with genuine pain. To be standing there, trying to do the right thing, trying to lead, while everyone around you is questioning your every move, while you're questioning yourself too. To have the weight of everyone's expectations, their frustrations, their doubts, on your shoulders. The crowd was silent, each person reflecting on the weight of Elon's words. They could feel the vulnerability in his voice, and it resonated with their own struggles. Elon's gaze moved over the room, his eyes meeting those of the people in the audience. That's something I've been grappling with lately, he admitted, his voice growing softer but no less intense. That loneliness. The kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone in a room, but from knowing that no matter how hard you try, some people will never understand you. They won't see the sacrifices you've made, the decisions you've wrestled with. They won't see the pain of carrying the weight of expectations that you don't know how to fulfill. There was a collective exhale in the room, as if everyone in the audience understood this feeling in their own lives. Elon paused, his hand moving slowly through his hair as he reflected. Moses, despite all of this, didn't give up, he said, his voice regaining its strength. He didn't quit, even when it would have been easier to. Even when the pressure was unbearable. Even when it probably felt like the whole world was against him. He kept going. He took a deep breath, looking out over the crowd, allowing the silence to fill the room. And that's what I'm learning to do, he said slowly. To keep going, even when it feels like the weight is too much. Even when the loneliness feels unbearable. To trust that even when the path ahead is unclear, the work is still worth doing. Moses didn't stop because things were hard. He didn't stop because he was lonely. He didn't stop because people didn't understand him. He kept going because he believed. He believed in the cause. He believed that what he was doing mattered. Elon's voice was steady now, a quiet strength underpinning his words. And that's what I need to remind myself of. That it's not about me. It's not about being perfect. It's about continuing to lead, even when things are hard, even when people doubt you. It's about trusting that the work you're doing is for something greater than yourself. It's about having faith that, even when the road is lonely, you're still walking towards something meaningful. The room was still, every listener caught in the power of his words. Elon's vulnerability had struck a chord with them, and they could feel the shared experience of carrying burdens that others might not see. There was a collective understanding between them, a bond that went beyond the surface of Elon Musk's public persona. Moses, Elon continued, showed me that even when you can't see the end, you can still make the journey. Even when no one else believes, you can still lead. Because the call to lead, to do something bigger than yourself, doesn't go away just because it gets hard. It doesn't go away because others question you or misunderstand you. It stays with you, and it keeps you moving forward, step by step, no matter how hard the journey becomes. He looked down for a moment, almost as though searching for the right words. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but it carried the weight of experience. And that's what I'm trying to hold on to right now, he said. That even when I feel like I'm standing alone, I'm not. Even when it feels like the weight of everything is on me, it's not. I'm not alone in this. Elon looked back up, his gaze sweeping over the audience, his eyes filled with a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. Moses had to lead despite the loneliness, despite the doubt. And that's what I'm learning to do too. To keep going, even when the journey feels impossibly hard. To trust that what we're building, what we're fighting for, is worth it, even when the path seems uncertain. The room was silent now, every person in it feeling the weight of his words settle deep within them. The truth of Elon's vulnerability, his willingness to share his own struggles, had opened something in the room. It wasn't just a speech anymore, it was a shared experience. And that's the thing about leadership, Elon said quietly. It's not about being perfect. It's not about having all the answers. It's about trusting that you're not in this alone. It's about knowing that even when you're standing on that mountain, looking at the promised land from a distance, the journey has still been worth it. It's about knowing that what you're doing matters, even when the world doesn't always see it. Elon took a deep breath, stepping back from the podium for a moment. The silence in the room was thick with emotion. As he looked out at the faces before him, he felt a deep connection, one that transcended the individual, that spoke to a shared purpose, a shared journey. And in that moment, Elon Musk understood something. The journey of leadership wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the faith to continue. The belief that even when things get difficult, when people doubt you, when you doubt yourself, there is still something greater at play. It was about the quiet strength to keep moving forward, step by step, trusting that what you're doing matters, even when the end is unclear. The crowd in the auditorium was almost palpable in their silence. The air was thick with introspection, each person seemingly absorbed by the profound weight of Elon Musk's words. He stood there for a moment, reflecting on the immense responsibility that came with leadership and the complexity of human connection. We think that leadership is all about the glory, about the recognition. We imagine it as a straight path with milestones and applause. But the truth is, it's more often than not about persistence, about believing in something when others can't see it, and sometimes about enduring in silence when the world doesn't understand the depth of your struggles. Elon's voice carried an undertone of understanding, a recognition of the price that came with pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The people in the room, many of whom had been inspired by his innovations and ventures, now saw a different side of the entrepreneur. They saw the weight he carried, the emotional cost of the relentless pursuit of his vision. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that success is a result of constant progress, constant movement forward. But sometimes, leadership means standing still. It means enduring even when it feels like you're walking through a storm, without knowing when it will end. He paused, his gaze shifting from face to face in the crowd. Moses, in his journey, spent years wandering through that wilderness. Years of struggle, frustration, and doubt. And yet, he didn't stop. He kept his faith in the mission, even when the end was nowhere in sight. Even when he couldn't see the promised land with his own eyes. Elon took a deep breath and continued, the words flowing with a newfound clarity. And that's something I've had to remind myself of lately, that the journey doesn't always make sense, not right away. You don't always see the end goal. Sometimes, it feels like you're lost in the desert. Sometimes, it feels like you're working harder than ever, but the destination seems to be moving further away. The audience was deeply absorbed in his narrative, and there was a sense of vulnerability in the way Elon had shifted from talking about Moses to speaking from his own experience. There was a personal resonance to his words now, an understanding that leadership was not just about power, but about sacrifice. I won't pretend that there aren't moments when I doubt everything I'm doing, he confessed. When the weight of all the decisions, all the responsibilities, becomes overwhelming. When I wonder if the sacrifices are worth it. But then, I think about Moses again. He had to keep going, not because he had all the answers, not because everything was perfect, but because the vision was bigger than him. The mission was greater than his own struggles. And I think that's the key. He looked up, his eyes steady and sure, though the emotional intensity was still present. The mission, the vision, is what drives you, what keeps you moving forward, even when everything else is falling apart. It's what sustains you when no one else believes in it, when no one else sees the potential. It's what keeps you going when you're walking through your own desert, feeling lost and uncertain. Because you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for something greater. The room was entirely still, each person in it connected by the raw, honest truth that Elon was sharing. It was a rare moment, one where the man who had been at the forefront of technological change, the visionary who had revolutionized industries, revealed his own inner struggles. And it made them understand him more deeply, more completely. Sometimes, leadership means keeping your head down, doing the work, even when it feels like no one notices. It means trusting that your actions are leading somewhere, even when you can't see the results yet. It means understanding that success doesn't always come in the form you expect. It comes in the quiet moments, The ones when you keep showing up, even when you feel like you're not making progress. Elon's voice softened as he spoke, as if speaking more to himself than to the audience. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. The idea that the work we do isn't just about the final product, or the end result, or even the public recognition. It's about the process. The act of showing up every single day, of putting in the work even when the outcome is uncertain. And more importantly, it's about keeping your vision alive, no matter how long it takes. For a moment, Elon looked away, his thoughts drifting. When he spoke again, there was a certain quiet determination in his tone. I looked back at Moses, and I realized that the reason he kept going wasn't because he knew everything would work out. He didn't. He didn't know that he would ever step foot in the promised land. But he believed in the vision, in the cause. And that belief is what carried him, what kept him going, day after day, even when the road seemed endless. The message was clear, and it resonated with everyone in the room. Leadership was not about fame or fortune. It wasn't about the accolades or the easy path. Leadership was about conviction. It was about staying true to your mission, even when you couldn't see the end, and even when the path ahead was unclear. Moses didn't stop because the journey was long or the challenges too great. He didn't stop because people doubted him or because he was uncertain of the outcome. He kept going because he believed in something bigger than himself. And that's the lesson I'm learning, Elon said, his voice now gaining strength once more. It's about having the faith to keep going, even when it feels impossible, even when the road is long and the end is distant. He paused, allowing the words to sink in. Because at the end of the day, it's not about reaching the promised land. It's about staying true to the mission. It's about believing in something greater than yourself, something worth fighting for. And even if you don't see the end yourself, the journey still matters. The work you do still matters. The crowd, still and silent, felt the profound truth in those words. They weren't just hearing about leadership from someone who had achieved extraordinary things. They were hearing about leadership from someone who had lived the struggles, who had faced the doubts, and who, like Moses, continued to press on despite the weight of it all. And in that moment, Elon Musk's message became clear to everyone in that room. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about persistence. It was about resilience. It was about continuing to believe in the mission, even when everything else seemed uncertain. Because sometimes, the journey itself was the reward, and the belief in something greater than yourself was what made it all worthwhile. As he finished speaking, Elon looked out at the faces before him, their eyes reflecting the same understanding that had been growing within him. He nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared journey they were all on, each with their own struggles, but all in it together.